and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. I'm here at the Malaysia Futures 2023 Forum, which is jointly organised by the LSE Sosui Hawk Southeast Asia Centre and Khazanah Research Institute. It's brought together leaders and thought leaders and academics and policymakers to think through the different possibilities, different futures Malaysia could have. One of the speakers joins me right now. Dr Koh Sin Yee is the Senior Assistant Professor in Asian Migration, Mobility and Diaspora at the Institute of Asian Studies at Universiti Brunei Darussalam. She's also the Adjunct Senior Research Fellow at Monash University, Malaysia. She describes herself as a human geographer working at the intersections of migration studies and urban studies using the lens of migration and mobility to understand the circulations of people, capital and aspirations in and through cities. Dr. Koh, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I want to chat to you about migration, which is a very complex issue to think through. So maybe we can begin our conversation today by you sharing a little bit about how you'd like us to frame the issue in our minds. How should we be thinking about, the public and also the policymakers, be thinking about the issue of migration?
That's a really interesting question. I think in terms of migration, like public perceptions or maybe through policymakers' perspectives, migration is often seen as something that is to be feared, something to be managed because there's this fear that it could get out of control if there's a sudden, perhaps large influx of migrant workers coming into the country, and then they will eat into our resources and so on and so forth. What I would like the public and also for policymakers to think about migration is not to think of it as an either-or, like it harms us, but to think of it in terms of a win-win solution. Like when migrants come in, they could bring with them certain knowledge or skills, technology. They could add into the cultural diversity that we have. There could be coexistence, and we could actually learn from each other. So that would be the key message that I would like the public and policymakers to consider.
Where do you think the fear comes from? I mean, I know it's not unique to any one country. It's almost a universal us against them sort of fear. But where do you think that comes from? When did we start fearing, others coming into our home spaces?
I guess it's a mix of maybe a certain element of disinformation, and maybe it is also a sense of fear-mongering as well. There is always a fear of the other because we do not understand them. Perhaps they come with different perspectives, different experiences, different ways of doing things that may be foreign to us. And that because we couldn't understand where they come from, we may see that as a threat. So that could be where this comes from.
Has migration been a long-standing trend? I feel like we're only now starting to look at trends in migration. We're thinking about migration in a national security sense. Has migration been happening since this beginning of mankind can travel?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the way that we think of migration these days is through the lens of the country, the nation state.
Yes.
And it's about border controls, it's about managing who comes into the country and who exits the country. But we need to think about migration beyond the nation state, I think, because as we know, migration has happened since ancient times. People have been moving around before nation states came into being. So even looking at Malaysia itself, our history, where our ancestors come from, it's really a mix of lots of mobilities within the region and also beyond the region.
Okay, so when we think about migration and mobility, what are some of the drivers, based on your research, what are some of the drivers for migration, particularly in Asia? What would you say are some of the drivers?
I think not just in Asia, but everywhere else.
So it's universal?
It's universal. Okay. Migration happens because people want to seek a better life. they migrate because they may have done some research, they may have heard from others who have migrated before them that perhaps life is better in another place, and therefore they go there in hopes that they could achieve a better life for themselves, for their families.
And how do we think about the people who have left and created lives elsewhere, the diaspora, so to speak, the concept of diaspora actually? Could you talk to me a little bit about how we think about, different diasporas in different parts of the world?
That's really interesting because the idea, the understanding of diaspora now, it's also seen through the lens of the nation state.
Right, yeah, exactly. What can you contribute back to the home country? Yeah.
So this idea that people who have migrated outside of the country, who have left, still have connections and a sense of belonging and loyalty back to the home country. And that's why this idea of the diaspora still having a sense of obligation, perhaps to contribute back to the home country. I guess it's desirable from the perspective of the nation state.
Okay. Can I ask you, should we be expecting the diaspora to contribute economically to the culture, to the benefit of the nation? Is that something that we should expect, or should there be an obligation?
I don't think there should be an expectation or that there should be an obligation. I think perhaps what nation states can do is to facilitate if members of the diaspora wish to contribute or wish to continue to be engaged in affairs in the home country. There can be policies or frameworks and programs set up to try and facilitate those kinds of interactions. But I do not think
we should
expect that every single member of the diaspora should contribute.
So how do you make sense of, I don't know whether this is a particular example, an instance that's particular to Malaysia, but whenever a Malaysian born makes it, does well abroad, we immediately claim the achievement as our own. Oh, this, Michelle Yeoh was a Malaysian-born Oscar winner, and we have a sense of pride in that. How do you make sense whenever you hear of, instances like that?
I think that's not unique to Malaysia. It's probably, you probably see this everywhere in any other country. There's a sense of pride of having a member of our national community or our community who have done well, who have succeeded in the international stage, and we want to celebrate that. We feel proud of that.
It's so interlinked, isn't it? Migration and mobility issues, the diaspora, it's so interlinked with issues of identity and belonging. Have you done any research or do you have observations as to how Asians in particular, when migrating to other host countries, how they navigate the challenges of thinking about identity and a sense of belonging in a new space, in a new situation?
It really depends on which kinds of destination countries the migrant goes to, and even down to the particular city or town that the person goes to, because the community makeup in those destination societies could be very different. For example, if someone migrates to a place where there is already an established diaspora community there, then maybe the sense of isolation won't be as much felt, and the settling in process could be easier or smoother compared to the same person going to a different destination context where maybe he or she would be the minority, like a very visible minority, without the kind of community support. And I would also think in terms of, let's say, finding food from your home country, or maybe some things that you have gotten used to in your everyday life that you couldn't get.
When we think about diaspora, the concept of assimilation, what are the challenges that people who have migrated to another country, particularly if it's a minority, as you mentioned, you're in a space where there aren't the diaspora is a minority, but the challenges of thinking through identity and belonging and assimilation. Have you done any observations on that? Where assimilation comes to play in people who migrate?
I haven't personally done research on this area, but assimilation is only one perspective in thinking about how migrants sort of integrate into a host society. Assimilation assumes that the migrant eventually will integrate and live alongside the host society. But a part of assimilation, there is also another perspective which celebrates diversity. And in that sense, you don't assume and expect that the migrant integrates into the host society. In fact, you sort of celebrate the fact that the migrant brings in a different kind of perspective in terms of culture, ways of thinking, and so these two coexist together.
Okay, all right, that's interesting. Okay, we're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. I'm chatting to Dr. Koh Sin Yee, who is a Senior Assistant Professor in Asian Migration, Mobility and Diaspora at the Institute of Asian Studies at Universiti Brunei Darussalam. We are here at the Malaysia Futures Forum 2023, organised by Khazanah Research Institute and the LSE Saw Swee Hock Southeast Asia Centre. Dr. Koh, let's come to the issue of forced migration, because I'm curious to know, most migration is self-motivated, right? So you want to go, you choose to migrate. But what about forced migration and displaced people, people who are facing a tragedy in their home country and are forced to migrate? What are the challenges you see in how the world is responding to forced migration and displaced people?
There's really generally a lack of consensus in terms of how forced migration is actually defined.
Okay.
And especially if you're going into the definitions of asylum seekers and refugees, particularly refugees. Because if a person attains a refugee status, it would mean that this person will receive protection and can be expected to be either integrated into a third country, for example, whereas asylum seekers often have to be kept waiting for the official outcome of their asylum status. Other than that, increasingly we are also seeing climate change related kind of migration. And currently, the definition of a refugee does not include climate change.
Oh, can you share a little bit about what that means, that it's climate crisis-driven forced migration?
Yeah, so migration that is driven by climate change is not yet officially recognized as a reason for granting people refugee status.
Okay, so you mean as in people in an area that is always flooded or prone to droughts or heat waves, moving away or seeking legal status in another country, that's not recognized.
That is not recognized under the current refugee convention.
Should it be?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I myself have not done research specifically about forced migration, so I don't feel, particularly equipped to say whether we should or should not do that.
Okay, all right. The other thing that had impacted migration and mobility was the fact that we went through a pandemic for years. Talk to me a little bit about how the pandemic, COVID, essentially affected migration patterns, not just across the world, but specifically also in Asia.
I think the pandemic sort of was a very disruptive global event, that I think makes a lot of people reconsider whether or not they want to migrate, and if they have migrated, whether or not they want to stay in that destination country. I guess depending on how that destination country managed the crisis, that could also shake their confidence, and they may want to consider moving to another different place. I think one of the major outcomes of that in terms of migration trends is that we would probably be increasingly seeing more regional type of migration rather than more long distance international migration.
Okay. All right. How does it also play into the issue of brain drain? I'm quite curious because, you know, we often talk about migration. It's also framed in this loss of talent, you know, narrative. Where does brain drain sit in the migration? It feels very one way, but migration and mobility also stands to gain from talent, right?
Yep, yep. Well, the brain drain narrative, again, it comes from the nation-state perspective, particularly the sending state narrative, thinking that the exit of their citizens would be a loss in terms of human capital because they have migrated elsewhere, they are contributing to the whole society instead of remaining in the home country and contributing to that home economy. But the debates around brain drain has also transitioned into discussions about brain circulation, or the last time that I spoke in the program I was talking about this as well. There are maybe certain programs and policies that encourage the members of the diaspora to circulate through. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will return permanently to the home country. They could still reside in their host society, but perhaps doing a series of visits back to the home country, contributing in terms of knowledge transfer, skills transfer, human capital training.
What would be needed in terms of policy support, you know, public conversation or mindset to facilitate this, so that we're thinking about it in terms of brain circulation and not just a brain drain?
I think first of all it's a mindset change, not to see the exit of members of the diaspora as disloyalty.
Right.
It's not really about disloyalty. As I said earlier, people migrate because they want a better life elsewhere, or maybe they're at the point when they migrate, there are other opportunities elsewhere that are not present in the home country. So first is that mindset change to accept that there are other ways of living. Migration is not just a one-off thing. People can leave, people can come back, they may leave again, but they may have left, but they will circulate through, you know, throughout.
And bring with them a whole host of experience and knowledge, right, to benefit, you know, whichever community that they're in at that point. In the couple of minutes that we have left, I do want to ask you, you know, following your research and your work, have you encountered any migration policies that have benefited or influenced positively the experiences and the outcomes of communities that have migrated?
One such migration policy I would say is like the post-study work visa programs that you have in the UK and Australia, for example. That would mean that international students studying in the host country, after they have graduated, this visa will give them, let's say, 1 year, 2 year, or 3 years post-graduation to find work in the host country. So it means that the host country can actually capitalize on this, you know, human capital to a certain extent. The international students that have graduated from the education system in the host country can actually capitalize upon and, you know, benefit from their contributions instead of them graduating and then leaving that host country.
Are you seeing a shift in the way people think about migration? We come full circle to our conversation at the start, in the way you said we should be, you know, reframing our narrative about migration and mobility. Are you seeing that being put to practice? Are people shifting out of the concept of fear and disloyalty and thinking about all the benefits and gains that we can have through migration and mobility?
I think there's a mix. You see some developments towards more positive views of migration, but also at the same time a recession into what I talked about earlier in terms of fear of the other. So it's a mix of both, and as you know, migration can sometimes be an emotional issue and sometimes can be played into a political issue.
It's very easy to be emotive about this issue, and I think it's also sometimes been used as such. You're absolutely right. Thank you so much for speaking with me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
That was Dr. Koh Sin Yee wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.